They laughed at him, a homeless man curled on a park bench, wrapped in a tattered army poncho. Teenagers mocked, filmed, and tossed trash at his feet. But when his ripped backpack spilled open, something slipped out that stopped him cold. Delta Force, ID real and worn, bearing the name Sergeant Major Jacob R. Maddox, what followed was a chain of revelations, hidden files, and silent salutes from those who once whispered his call sign, Ghosthound. This isn't just a story about judgment, it's about memory, sacrifice, and what it means to never really come home. What if the man they ignored once led missions that never officially happened? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sun was still low when the first joggers arrived. Long shadows stretched across the frost-beaten grass of Marlow Park, and the city's usual noise hadn't yet bled into the morning. A few runners followed the paved path that looped along the edge of the duck pond, earbuds in, sweat already beading on their temples. A dog barked somewhere off-trail, the leash jingling in rhythm with its sprint. Most people kept their eyes forward. They always did. But there was one bench just past the gazebo and the statue of the old mayor that everyone glanced at and then quickly away. The man had been there for weeks now, or maybe months. No one seemed quite sure. Wrapped in what looked like a faded army poncho, he stayed curled up on the splintered wood slats, head tucked down, boots poking out the edge. Some assumed he was asleep. Others wondered if he was breathing. A few whispered that they had seen him move when no one was watching, adjusting a strap, shifting his weight, waking in an instant as if from a nightmare. Every morning, he was there before the sun came up, and every night, he was still there when the lights in the park turned on, casting long cones of yellow light across the benches and littered walkways. He didn't ask for change. He didn't speak. He didn't make signs. He just existed in that uncomfortable in-between, too still to seem dangerous, too quiet to be easily pitied. This morning, a group of teenagers showed up just after 7 a.m. Loud in a way only people untouched by consequence can be. There were 4 of them. One wore a varsity jacket. Another had a Bluetooth speaker dangling from his backpack. A girl in oversized sunglasses filmed everything on her phone. They were heading somewhere they didn't particularly care about, passing time by mocking everything they saw along the way. When they saw him, the laughter started. Soft at first, then louder. "Yo, look at this dude," one of the boys said. Pointing at the bench, "He's in full camo." "What, he think he's on a mission?" The girl giggled. "He looks dead." "Seriously? Is he dead?" "I dare you to go poke him," said the tall one. $10. They gathered around the bench like kids around a zoo enclosure. The man didn't move. One of the boys leaned in closer, waving a hand in front of the figure's covered face. "Nothing. I think it's just a pile of clothes," he said, laughing nervously. "Or maybe one of those weird art pieces or something. Social commentary." The girl raised her phone higher. "Nope. He's real. Look, he just moved." Another boy tossed a crumpled fast food bag toward the bench. It bounced off the edge of the man's boot and landed on the ground. Still, he didn't speak. Then the boy with the speaker crouched low and shouted, "Hey, General, you forget your troops." He saluted mockingly, then broke into a run as the others laughed behind him. He sat up slightly, his eyes opened. The movement was slow, deliberate. One arm reached under the poncho and adjusted something strapped to his side. His head turned, not to face them, but to scan the area behind them. The gaze wasn't scared. It wasn't angry. It was ... trained ... Vince. The groundskeeper had been watching from behind a nearby maintenance shed, sipping lukewarm coffee from a cracked thermos. He'd seen this play out before. Different kids, different days, always the same man, always the same bench. But this morning, something felt different. There was something about the way the man had sat up, the way his hand moved, not like someone waking from sleep, but like someone checking perimeter. The teens had already moved on, laughing about the video they'd captured, eager to post it before they forgot. The girl uploaded it with a caption that read, "War vet or weirdo, you decide." They disappeared down the path, swallowed by the city's morning routines. Back at the bench, the man laid back down slowly. He pulled the poncho tighter around him and closed his eyes again. But now Vince was sure of it. He wasn't asleep. He was listening, waiting, still part of something, even if the world had forgotten what. His boots were the kind issued to men who walked through dust and fire for months at a time. The kind meant to survive more than a war. Their leather had turned a shade of grayish-brown that no factory could replicate. Scuffs covered the toes. The soles, though patched with layers of glue and rubber, still bore the faint outlines of treads made for gripping rock and gravel under full combat weight. The laces weren't original. One side was frayed paracord, the other a stretched bootlace, dyed darker at the ends where melted plastic held it together. They had been tightened with a precision that felt out of place on a man with no dress. The man's frame was wiry beneath the layers, broad shoulders, a neck thickened by years of carrying more than just gear. His spine arched ever so slightly. Even in sleep, or what passed for it, his arms stayed close to his sides. One palm always half-curled, like it had once held something weighty. And his fingers, those told their own story, calluses formed thick ridges across his palms and fingertips, some worn smooth by time, but it was the scars that stood out then, pale lines crisscrossing the backs of his hands, some barely healed, others years old. One jagged mark ran from the base of his thumb to the middle of his forearm, not from an accident, not from a fall. That was the kind of wound someone survived because they knew how to keep blood inside their body until help came, or didn't. The face was hidden beneath a mat of gray-speckled beard and shadowed by the hood of his poncho. But now and then, when he stirred, the morning light would catch the corner of his jaw, or the mark of something that hit hard and didn't apologize. He didn't snore, didn't sprawl, no limbs dangled. Instead, he slept, in a compact coil, knees drawn up slightly, spine aligned. One shoulder braced against the slats of the bench, as if expecting to roll off and land on his feet if he had to. There was a tautness to his rest, a coiled readiness that refused to surrender, even to exhaustion. Like he was trying to conserve energy in case something went wrong. And somewhere deep inside, he believed it might. No one walking by noticed this. Not the joggers, not the mothers pushing strollers, not the teenagers recording him for a cheap laugh. They saw a man on a bench, maybe drunk, maybe crazy, maybe invisible. But none of them saw the moments between moments when his body flinched slightly at the echo of a distant car backfiring, or how his breathing changed when someone approached too fast, shallow, then still, eyes open. Just for a second. When he woke, he didn't stretch, he didn't groan. He rose in a single motion, slow but practiced, feet planted first, spine upright, scanning before his eyes had fully opened. His hand would, or a map that once mattered. He never flinched at cold, never complained at rain. When the wind swept in across the park and sent leaves flying, he adjusted only his footing and tucked his collar higher. Even then, his eyes stayed fixed on some invisible perimeter, only he seemed to understand. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, it was often a nod, a grunt, a clipped word that said less than it meant. There was a silence around him, not just the quiet of loneliness, but the deep quiet of someone who had seen too much to fill the space with noise. Once, the man had shifted his weight subtly, turning his head just enough to track the noise. But instead of looking up like most people, his eyes scanned the horizon, the trees, the rooftops, searching for what might follow. Not the chopper, but what came next? That kind of thinking never leaves you. To most, he was just another shadow on the bench, a figure wrapped in military green, taking up space nobody wanted. But to anyone who looked closely, the truth was written in his movements, his hands, his boots. He wasn't just sleeping rough, he was surviving still, even now. The wind had picked up by mid-morning, carrying with it the faint smell of fryer grease from a food truck parked near the edge of Marlowe Park. Trash rustled along the curb, and the benches, once warmed slightly by the sun, had cooled again under shifting clouds. Vince stood by the maintenance shed, his gloved hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched in 15 minutes. He was supposed to be repairing a broken irrigation pipe near the rose beds, but his eyes kept drifting. Back toward the bench near the war statue, the same bench, the same man. The man hadn't moved much all morning, just enough to adjust the poncho when the breeze exposed his boots. Vince had watched him shift weight from one side to the other and run his fingers along a frayed strap that dangled from the canvas pack beneath the bench, not a word spoken, not a glance upward. Still, Vince knew he was alert. The man never fully let go of the world around him, even if he pretended to sleep through it. The teens returned around 10 a.m., laughing before they were even fully visible. 4 of them again, the same group from earlier in the week. The tall boy with the varsity jacket carried a soda in one hand and a greasy paper bag in the other. The girl trailed behind, phone already raised, thumb-tapping record. The speaker in the backpack thumped faintly with bass, just low enough to be obnoxious. They weren't heading anywhere this time, they had come to linger. To provoke. Vince saw them angle toward the bench from the side path, their footsteps louder than needed, their conversation more performative than genuine. The tall boy slowed as they neared the man. He extended his hand in a mock salute, sharp and exaggerated. "Permission to speak, Sergeant Sleepy," he barked, snorting with laughter before taking a sip of his drink. Another boy, shorter, stepped forward and bent down near the man's boots. "Sir, are you protecting this bench with your life?" he said, voice syrupy with sarcasm. "Is this enemy territory?" The girl laughed. "He's probably dreaming of crawling through mud. Something. Look at him. He hasn't moved in hours." Without hesitation, one of the boys tossed the empty soda cup at the ground in front of the man's feet. The lid bounced once, ice spilling out, pooling into a slick patch on the pavement. A second wrapper paper from a burger, half-soaked, and grease followed. It landed against the man's boot. Still no reaction. They laughed louder. The tall boy pulled a packet of ketchup from his jacket and tossed it toward the bench, as if expecting a response. It hit the man's leg and burst, red streaks landing across the canvas, poncho like blood. For a moment, the group went quiet. The girl lowered her phone, then the man shifted. It wasn't a dramatic movement, no sudden rise, no confrontation. He simply sat up straighter. His head turned slightly, enough to see them from beneath the brim of the hood. His eyes open-focused, calm, unreadable. The teens froze, not out of fear, not yet, but something about the way he looked at them, like he wasn't really seeing them, but assessing them, disrupted the performance. They had expected either silence or fury. They got neither, only calculation. The tall boy forced a laugh. "Okay, Gramps," he muttered, "keep fighting the good fight." They turned away then, still laughing, but not as loud now. The sound scattered quickly in the wind. Their path took them down the hill toward the tennis courts, and soon the music from the speaker faded behind them. Vince watched it all from behind the shed. He didn't interfere. Not yet. He'd learned the difference between a moment that needed interruption and one that just needed watching. But his jaw was tight. His grip on the coffee cup had left a faint crack in the foam lid. He walked toward the bench. When the teens disappeared from view, the man was already reclining again. The hood pulled low. Vince said nothing, just bent down, picked up the ketchup-smeared wrapper, and tossed it in the nearby bin. He hesitated, then retrieved the soda cup, now half-frozen. When he glanced at the man, their eyes met briefly. No thanks, no apology, just an acknowledgement. Vince gave a single nod and turned back toward the tool shed. Some mornings, the work was heavy lifting. Other mornings, it was just being there. It started with a shove. They had circled back after lunch, a pizza box in hand, soda cans clinking in their backpacks. The laughter was louder this time, more forced, like they were trying to prove something. The girl had her phone out, again, recording even before they reached the bench. Vince wasn't nearby now. He'd gone to the other side of the park to deal with a broken sprinkler head. There was no one watching except a few pigeons and an older woman sitting by the pond with earbuds in. The man hadn't moved in hours, at least not in any obvious way. He lay curled under his poncho, the tip of one boot resting against the bench. Leg, his pack tucked tightly underneath him, strapped to the metal armrest. From a distance, he looked no different than the city's dozens of invisible residents. People folded into corners and out-of-the-way places, but up close, the details told a different story. The pack wasn't random. It was the kind you could drag through sand and brush, faded to a dull olive. It seems reinforced with hand-stitched repairs. Not new, but not careless. One of the teens, a shorter one, mouth always running, muttered, "Bet he's got something weird in there." He nudged the tall one. $10, says it's full of like old socks and beef jerky." The girl just laughed and kept filming. "Go on then, open it." The tall boy hesitated, then stepped forward. "Yo, let me see your bag, Gramps," he said, crouching beside the bench. No response. He reached under and gave the pack a tug. Didn't move. The man's arm shifted slightly, tightening the grip on the strap, but he didn't speak. He didn't look. The boy tugged harder, twisting the bag sideways. "Hey," he barked as if offended. The thing didn't come loose. Then it happened. He yanked hard enough that one of the shoulder straps tore loose from the stitching. The sound was sharp, unmistakable, canvas ripping, a buckle clattering on the sidewalk. The bag dropped sideways, its flap falling open. Papers spilled out, a few crumpled printouts, a folded topographic map, a weathered notebook whose spine was held together with duct tape, and something else, a small black case. Hard plastic popped. Open as it hit the ground. From inside slid a laminated card, the edges curved from age, but the lettering still crisp. It caught the sunlight for a split second, then settled face up on the path. None of them moved at first. The girl stepped forward to get a better look. She squinted, lowering the phone for once. "Wait, what is that?" The short one leaned over. "Some kind of ID, dude. Is that real?" The card was matte black, with a gold emblem in the corner, an eagle and sword insignia. Along the top, United States Army Special Operations Command. Below that, the name Jacob R. Maddox, Sergeant Major, blood type, clearance code, bottom right, Delta Force. "Is this like a prop or something?" the girl asked, but her voice had dropped in pitch. "Less sure now." "No way," said the tall one. He bent down and picked it up with 2 fingers, as if afraid it might burn him. He turned it over, reading both sides. This looks real. It was then that the man sat up. No words, no threats, just a movement smooth, steady, with a fluidity that felt practiced. He looked not at the card, not even at the boys, but at the horizon behind them. His eyes moved left, then right, scanning the line of trees, the rooftops beyond. His hand went to the pack, gathering the scattered papers with a kind of practiced urgency, not panic. Something else, something learned. "Give it back," he said, voice low, steady. The tall boy hesitated. "Give it back." The teen stepped forward and placed the card on the bench, avoiding the man's eyes. The short one laughed nervously. "Guess we woke up, Rambo." The girl didn't laugh. She turned off the recording. The man picked up the ID and slid it back into the case, then into the pack. He didn't say another word. He just sat there, silent and still, as if waiting for something else to happen, as if expecting it. The tension in his posture hadn't left. The group backed away, their steps slower now. The game was over. They didn't know what they'd touched, only that it was more than they'd bargained for. By the time Vince returned 10 minutes later, the bench was clean again. No papers, no noise. Just a man in an old poncho, sitting perfectly still, eyes open. Watching. The silence that followed was unlike anything that had come before it. It wasn't the absence of sound so much as the presence of something heavier. A shift, a weight. The kind of silence that makes people realize too late they've crossed a line they didn't know existed. The card lay between them on the bench for a moment longer, until the man picked it up with 2 fingers, brushed off a streak of dust, and slid it back into its case. The movement was slow and precise, not rushed or angry, just deliberate. His hands, calloused and steady, had done this before. Not once or twice, but 1,000 times, maybe more. The kind of muscle memory that didn't fade, even after everything else had. The ID was real, not a novelty piece or some collectible, passed around at a flea market. It had the ridged feel of government-issued laminate, the microprint security details, the fading on the corner from years of wear. The lettering was clean, even under the grime. Jacob R. Maddox, Sergeant Major, Delta Force. The words didn't shout, but they didn't have to. It was the emblem that did it for the girl, the sword and lightning bolt over a black background. She'd seen something like it before, in a documentary her dad had been obsessed with. The tone of her voice changed. "That's real, isn't it?" She asked no one in particular, her voice hushed now. The tall boy didn't respond. He just stepped back, eyes still on the man. His hand dropped the remaining trash he'd been holding without realizing it. The short one, the loud one, looked uncertain now. "Delta Force," he muttered. "I thought that was just like Navy SEALs or something." The girl shook her head. No, it's more than that. Still, the man said nothing. His breathing was steady. He sat straight now, no longer hidden beneath a poncho, and the shape of him became clearer. Not frail, not broken down, just compact. Built like a machine left to rust, but never quite stopped working. He had the kind of posture that didn't come from comfort, it came from habit. He looked not at them, but past them, as if measuring their distance to something only he could see. The girl lowered her phone. She didn't press record again. Vince, returning from across the lawn, saw the shift before he heard it. From 100 feet away, he could sense the tension had snapped, replaced by a kind of awkward reverence. The kids looked different now. No longer mocking, no longer entertained. They looked unsettled. Vince recognized the shape of the black plastic case in the man's hand. He'd seen one once, years ago, when he worked supply at Fort Carson. You didn't see them often, and when you did, you didn't ask questions. "Everything all right here?" Vince asked, stepping closer, his voice casual but firm. The man gave a single nod. "Just that? Nothing more." The teens mumbled excuses. Something about getting to school, about needing to be somewhere else. They left without running, but without looking back either. The girl wiped her phone screen on her sleeve, as if trying to erase what had been captured. The tall boy glanced over his shoulder. One last time before they disappeared around the path's curve, Vince sat down on the opposite end of the bench. Not close enough to intrude, just near enough to say he was there. "Didn't know you were." "Delta?" he said after a moment. The man didn't answer right away. He rubbed his thumb over the ID card before slipping it back into the pack, securing the flap with care. Then he looked at Vince, eyes sharp but calm. "Didn't think anyone needed to know," he replied. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse, but even no anger. No bitterness. Just fact. Vince nodded. Fair enough. They sat like that for a while, 2 men, 1 bench, and a silence that meant something. The kind of silence you respected. Across the park, the city buzzed along. People walking dogs, drinking coffee, taking calls. None of them knew that the man they'd passed for months, the one they'd ignored, laughed at, pitied, had once carried orders few people ever saw. Orders that didn't exist, missions that weren't acknowledged, a name on a card that opened doors in places most never knew existed. Vince looked down at the ground and shook his head softly. "Well," he said, more to himself than anyone else, "that explains a lot." Vince didn't rush. He never did. Not in the years since he'd left the base. Not in the years since his knees had begun to ache in the cold, and certainly not now. But something about the black ID card lying in the grass made his pace shift. His boots pressed into the earth with just a little more weight. He bent down slowly, careful not to startle anyone, and picked it up. The surface was still warm from the sun, but the edges were worn smooth. He turned it over in his hand once. Then again, his eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. He read the name aloud, just a whisper to himself. Jacob R. Maddox, Sergeant Major. Delta. He'd seen credentials before fake ones. This was the real kind. He knew from the detail, from the way the light refracted off the embedded seal, from the slight bend in the laminate that came only from years of being carried close to the body, where sweat and time left their mark. And it wasn't just the card, it was the way the man had moved when it fell, the way his posture had shifted, not in fear, but in readiness. Not like someone hiding from his past, but like someone quietly guarding it. Vince turned toward the man still sitting on the bench, shoulders hunched forward, hands resting on his knees. He had pulled the poncho tighter again, not out of modesty, but instinct, the kind of reflex you didn't unlearn. He looked older now that he was upright, not just in years, but in weight. Like he carried something that never set itself down. Vince stepped closer, slowly, holding the card out with both hands as though returning something sacred. The man took it without speaking. His fingers brushed Vince's palm, rough and calloused but steady. He looked down at the ID and then slipped it back into the front pocket of the canvas pack, where it disappeared beneath the flap. With Delta, his eyes moved over the tree line again, then the sidewalk, then Vince's boots. He said Vince sat down slowly, leaving a respectful space between them. The bench creaked beneath his weight, the way it always did when he eased onto it after walking the park grounds. He rubbed his hands together, more out of thought than cold. "They don't just hand these out," he said. "You didn't buy that in a pawn shop." "No," the man replied. His voice was gravel, like it hadn't been used in too long. Vince glanced at him, trying to read what kind of quiet this was. Some kinds were walls, others were wounds. He guessed this one was both. "I did supply for a while," Vince said. "Back in the day, Fort Carson, I used to process gear returns. Saw a few of those IDs, not many, not like that." He paused, then added, "Didn't know you were someone." The man's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. "Not anymore," he said. Vince let the silence sit. He didn't try to fill it with small talk or praise. He just sat there beside the man, watching the wind tug at the trees. The sound of traffic far enough away to feel like another world. "Name's Vince," he said after a while. The man looked at him, eyes dark and unreadable. "Jake," he replied. "Used to be Sergeant Major Maddox. Now just Jake." Vince nodded. "All right, Jake." For a long moment, they sat in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that comes when two people understand there are things you don't ask right away, things that take time. Vince reached down and picked up a scrap of paper the wind had nudged toward his boot. It was part of a folded map. He handed it over without asking what it was. Jake took it, slid it into the side pouch of the rucksack, and said nothing. "You've been out here long?" Vince finally asked. Jake shrugged. "A while?" Vince didn't press. He just nodded again, rubbed the back of his neck, and said, "Well, I'm usually around if you ever need anything." Jake didn't reply, but he didn't look away either, and that, for now, was enough. The sirens weren't loud, not the kind that blared through intersections and made people pull to the curb. These were the quiet kind, the short burst of sound you hear when someone wants you to know they're arriving, not chasing. A black and white cruiser rolled up to the edge of Marlowe Park, two uniformed officers stepping out before the tires had fully stopped. One was tall and broad, his belt sagging slightly under the weight of too much gear. The other was younger, leaner, still with that freshly pressed posture that hinted at academy rules. Still echoing in his head, Vince spotted them the moment they stepped onto the grass. He knew that look, half professional, half skeptical. The way they scanned the park, eyes bouncing from path to playground to tree line, looking for someone out of place, and today that someone had a name, or at least a location. The bench. Jake hadn't moved. He sat with his hands folded over the top of his canvas bag, his head tilted slightly downward, watching the officers with the calm resignation of someone who had done this before. His body didn't tense, but something in his shoulders changed. Vince saw it, a quiet setting of bone and muscle, the way a man might ready himself without seeming to. The teenagers were waiting by the path, not far from the pond. They stood in a cluster, speaking over one another in the jittery, defensive rhythm of people trying to rewrite a story before it was finished. The girl still had her phone in her hand. The tall boy gestured a lot, pointing, shrugging, his voice rising with every sentence. The younger cop approached them while the older one walked toward the bench. Vince stood up before the officer got there. He raised a hand, not high, just enough to show he wasn't a problem. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You involved?" he asked. "Not really," Vince said, "but I saw most of what happened." The officer looked past him at Jake, who still hadn't spoken. "We got a call about a confrontation. A homeless man reportedly threatened some kids and got physical." That him, Vince's jaw worked slightly before he responded. Those kids ripped his pack open and started filming him for laughs. He didn't touch them, didn't even speak until they dropped this. From his coat pocket, Vince pulled the black laminated ID and held it out. The officer looked down, uninterested at first, but then paused. He took the card, turned it over, and his expression changed. A crease formed between his brows. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. Vince nodded toward Jake. The officer glanced back at Jake, who finally looked up just enough to meet the man's eyes. No challenge, no shame, just a level gaze, as if he already knew how this would go. The officer looked back at the ID, then at his partner, who was still talking to the teens. He called him over with a sharp, short whistle. The younger officer jogged up and took the ID when it was handed to him. He read it once, blinked, then read it again. "This is real?" he asked quietly. The older cop nodded. "It's real." They both looked at Jake now with something different. Not exactly deference, but not suspicion either. The tone had shifted. We need to ask you a few things, the older one said. Just procedure. Jake nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then stood, not stiffly, not with effort, just smooth, like a man whose muscles remembered the exact pace at which to rise when being addressed in uniform. The girl called out from across the path, "Are you going to arrest him or not?" The younger officer glanced at her, then back at Jake, then at Vince. "He's not under arrest," he said firmly. "But he threatened us." The tall boy shouted, "No," Vince said quietly. "He didn't." The older officer turned back to Jake. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Jake looked down at his bag. "Just here," he said. The officer looked conflicted. "We'll need to make a report," he said, softer now. "Won't take long." Jake nodded again, then followed them toward the cruiser, his pack slung over one shoulder, Vince trailing a few steps behind. No handcuffs, no shouting, just 3 men walking. Through the park, 2 in uniform. One in worn boots with a badge in his bag that once meant he answered to no one but the mission. The ride downtown was quiet, no sirens, no radio chatter, just the hum of the cruiser and the soft clink of gear shifting as they pulled onto the main road. Jake sat in the back, not cuffed, but still enclosed behind the plexiglass partition. His pack sat on the seat beside him, the flap tucked shut, the edges of old documents just visible under the worn canvas. He stared straight ahead, not out the window, not at the officers, just still. The older officer drove. Vince sat in the front passenger seat, hands resting on his knees, not speaking unless spoken to. He had insisted on coming along not as a witness, he said, but because it didn't feel right for Jake to be brought in alone. The officer hadn't argued. He didn't seem entirely sure what he was supposed to do anymore. "They're not booking him," the officer had said back at the park. "We just need to file a report. Let him cool off. It's for his safety." Vince had heard that before. In town halls, on city council panels, in outreach meetings where officers explained why some people were better off being removed for a few hours, for their own good. It wasn't always a lie, but it wasn't always the truth either. Mostly, it was a way to buy time until the paperwork decided what came next. They pulled into the side lot of the precinct, a squat concrete building tucked between an old warehouse and a boarded-up pharmacy. Inside, the station smelled of coffee left too long on a hot plate and the trace of cleaning products that couldn't quite cover the undercurrent of sweat and metal. Jake was led through the side entrance. No cuffs, no holding cell, just a chair. In an empty processing room with scuffed linoleum floors and a desk bolted to the wall, the younger officer, the one who had squinted at Jake's ID, like it might bite sat at a terminal in the corner, typing dot, Vince leaned against the wall just outside the room, arms crossed, eyes on everything. A few passing officers gave him the once over, curious about the civilian loitering near processing, but none of them said a word. Inside, the younger officer kept typing. At first it was routine, entering names, checking incident logs, verifying ID numbers, but then he paused. His fingers hovered above the keys, the glow from the monitor casting pale light across his brow. He leaned closer, scrolled down once, then again, and then he stopped moving altogether. Jake sat still, saying nothing. The officer blinked, straightened, then looked around quickly, almost like he thought someone might be watching him. He clicked something on the screen, and then it disappeared, replaced by a standard form. Just another blank field to fill in. But whatever he had seen, it had changed him. The confidence he'd walked in with the youthful certainty that came from rules and routines had dulled. He stood and stepped out into the hallway where Vince was waiting. "Can I talk to you for a second?" the officer asked. Vince raised an eyebrow, but followed him into a side office, the door clicking softly shut behind them. "I looked up his name," the officer said, "just to verify things." "Okay, Vince," said carefully. "I found the standard service records enlistment, assignments, discharge status." But then something else came up, a file. He paused. It wasn't supposed to be there. It was ... flagged. There were redactions, whole pages, and a security warning at the bottom, not the usual kind. This one said, "Access restricted, clearance required." Level 3 or higher, Vince said nothing, just waited. "I've never seen that before," the officer added. "Not in routine lookups, not for retirees. His name pulled something I shouldn't have seen. something locked. Vince nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "Then stop looking," he said. The officer hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. "He's not in trouble. I'll file it as a safety hold. He can go in a bit." Back in the processing room, Jake hadn't moved. His hands rested lightly on his knees, eyes steady, waiting. He didn't ask what the officer had seen. He didn't need to. He had lived enough of his life behind lines that didn't exist on maps to know when someone had touched a classified wire. Vince stepped back into the room. "Just a few more minutes," he said. Jake nodded and went on waiting. The precinct printer clicked on by itself. It startled no one. At first, printers always seemed to whir to life on a delay, spitting out forgotten documents or duplicates no one remembered sending. But the younger officer, still seated at the terminal in the corner of the administrative office, leaned forward slowly as the first page emerged. It was a request he hadn't submitted. A background fetch, likely triggered by a secondary verification system once he'd entered Jacob R. Maddox's identification code. He reached for the paper cautiously, eyes flicking across the page as lines of black ink assembled a portrait of a man no one had really seen in that park. At the top, a clean header, United States Armed Internal Review. Below it, the familiar layout of a military service file name, rank, serial number. Maddox, Jacob R. Sergeant Major, retired, but below that, it unraveled into something stranger. Where most files detailed enlistment dates, deployment rotations, unit assignments, this one was fragmented. Some entries were there: Somalia, 1993, Afghanistan, 2002, Colombia, 2008. But the descriptions ended in ellipses, then resumed pages later with references to unnamed operations, taskings identified only by code. The officer flipped the page. Entire blocks were redacted. Thick black lines, inches long, struck through entire sections of operational text. One page listed commendations, but didn't elaborate. Awarded the Silver Star with Valor Device, circumstances classified. Commendation for Operation Lantern Echo, restricted clearance. Nominated for Distinguished Service Cross, pending review documentation, redacted. The officer's fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. There was a moment when all the noise in the precinct dropped out. The phones ringing, the muttering of officers nearby, the shuffling of paperwork. All of it faded under the weight of what he was holding. He read again the list of places: Somalia, Afghanistan, Colombia. But with each country, the dates matched moments in U.S. history that had long been stripped of detail. Not because they were unimportant, but because too many things had gone wrong. Maddox had been there, not adjacent, not peripherally. He was part of the reason the missions remained ghost stories in military archives. He flipped to the final page. Post-operation debriefing withheld. Access level required for A or higher. Immediate forwarding to JSOC Intelligence Control, Fort Bragg. Subject's status discharged with non-public commendation. Surveillance discontinued in 2013. The officer's face had drained of color. Set the papers down slowly, as though afraid they might burn through the desk. He wasn't supposed to be looking at this. And yet, now that he couldn't unread what was in front of him. He glanced through the office window toward the holding room. Maddox sat alone on the bench inside, not hunched or weary like the man he'd first seen at the park. He still controlled his spine straight, his shoulders level. He didn't fidget. He didn't blink much. He looked, the officer thought, like he was waiting for someone to walk in with orders. The door creaked open behind him, and Vince stepped into the office, holding a disposable cup of station coffee. "Everything all right?" Vince asked, eyeing the stack of paper. The officer slid the pages into a manila folder, one corner already curling. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think we just brought in someone we were never supposed to find again." Vince exhaled slowly. What happens when someone forgets how to disappear? The officer nodded. He looked at the file once more before sliding it into the bottom drawer of his desk. Locked it, said nothing. Across the hallway, Maddox still hadn't moved. His eyes tracked something only he could see in old memory, a pattern in the walls. Maybe just the rhythm of time passing quietly around him. There was no anger in his expression, no frustration, only a familiarity. As if this being found, being evaluated, being misunderstood, was a place he had visited before, and expected to visit again. Vince didn't like using his phone for much. He kept it simple. No apps, no internet, just a few numbers stored under first names and initials. One of those numbers hadn't been dialed in nearly 2 years. It wasn't a number you used lightly. Not unless you had a reason. Not unless the old instincts came back knocking. He stepped outside the precinct into the pale afternoon sun. The breeze had picked up, rattling the dried leaves in the parking lot. A patrol car pulled in, engine low, and somewhere across the street, a dog barked at nothing. Vince leaned against the hood of his truck, scrolled through the names, and found the one he needed. He hesitated for a second before pressing the call button. It rang twice. Then a voice picked up clear, clipped calm. "Yeah, Colonel," Vince said. "It's Vince Marks." A pause. "Vince," the voice replied. "Been a while." "Yeah, I wouldn't call unless I had a reason." Another. Pause then. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Vince said. "But I think I found someone, name's Jacob Maddox, picked up earlier today. No charges, but it brought some things to the surface." The line went quiet. Vince waited. He knew better than to fill silence when the other person was thinking. "I looked at his ID," Vince continued. "Delta Force, Sergeant Major, retired. At least that's what the card says. Still nothing." "Guy's been living in the park," Vince said, carrying a pack that's older than most cops in this building. Some teenagers tore it open. Card fell out. Police brought him in for his own safety. Supposedly, one of the officers ran his name. It pulled a file with redacted ops across 3 continents. Then, finally, the voice returned. "What do you want to know?" the colonel asked. Vince looked out over the street, watching cars pass like nothing had changed. "I want to know who he was before this. I want to know what kind of man we're dealing with." Another pause, longer this time, and then a faint exhale on the line, like someone letting go of something they hadn't meant to carry for so long. "What was his call sign?" Vince asked. The response came soft, almost hesitant. "Ghosthound." Vince straightened. The word settled between them like dust in still air. He'd heard it before, years ago, not on record, not on base, but whispered in circles, passed around late at night when training turned to memory. When men talked about the ones who were never officially there, Ghosthound, the guy you sent when you needed something. Impossible done quietly. The guy who came back when others didn't. "You sure?" Vince asked, though he already knew the answer. The colonel's voice grew firmer. "He went into places we didn't acknowledge. Black cell stuff. Off book. When it was bad enough that plausible deniability wasn't a concern anymore, I didn't think those guys ever came back," Vince said. "They don't," the colonel replied. "Not really." Vince glanced back. Toward the precinct building. "He's quiet, calm, doesn't ask for anything. He won't," the colonel said. "He was trained not to. After Lantern Echo, he disappeared. We figured that meant either he died or chose not to come." "Home Lantern Echo?" Vince asked. "Forget I said that." Vince didn't press. He'd already heard more than he expected. "Look," the colonel added after a moment, "if he's back, it's not by choice. Something pushed him out of wherever he was hiding, and whatever it is, you don't want to be on the wrong side of it." Vince nodded, though the colonel couldn't see it. "Appreciate it," he said. "Keep your distance, Vince," the colonel warned. "Men like him, they don't go quietly, and they don't like being seen." Vince ended the call, slid the phone back into his jacket pocket. He stood there for a long time before going back inside. The name echoed in his head. The station lights buzzed faintly overhead, a dull, flickering hum that made the room feel colder than it was. Vince stepped back inside with 2 paper cups in hand, both steaming through their lids. He moved with quiet purpose, the kind of calm that came from years of dealing with things most people preferred to ignore. There were no other civilians in the hallway, now just a desk clerk tapping away on a keyboard and the occasional radio squawk from deeper inside the building. Jake, his hands rested on his knees, his posture unchanged. The canvas pack was at his feet, zipped now, pulled close to his boots like he expected someone to try and take it again. His head tilted up slightly when Vince approached, but he didn't speak. Vince held out the coffee. Jake stared at it for a moment like it might be something else, something with strings. Then, slowly, he reached for the cup, taking it with steady fingers. He held it just under his nose for a breath, then wrapped both hands around it. "No questions," Vince said, "just figured it might help." Jake nodded once. The faintest tilt of his chin. No thank you, no small talk. Vince sat down beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. He sipped from his own cup and leaned back against the wall. For a long time, they sat in silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled, the kind that felt earned. The air smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Somewhere nearby, a copy machine clicked to life. Neither of them moved. Then, almost inaudibly, Jake spoke. Didn't think anyone remembered Ghosthound. The words hung there for a moment. Vince looked over slowly, unsure if he'd heard right. Jake's gaze was straight ahead, fixed on some point that wasn't there. He hadn't spoken to anyone since arriving. Not really, but now, the name had surfaced, pulled from some vault that rarely opened. I made a call, Vince said carefully. Someone I used to know. Jake nodded again, eyes still distant. Figures, wanted to know what I was looking at. And, Jake asked, voice dry. Vince turned the cup in his hands, thinking, he didn't say much, just a name, yours. And the call sign. Jake let out a sound, almost a laugh, but without humor. More like breath catching on memory. Ghosthound, he repeated, as if testing the shape of it on his tongue. Been a long time since anyone said that out loud. Vince didn't reply. He knew better than to dig dot. Jake took a sip of coffee, winced slightly at the heat, and then held the cup in both hands again. He didn't seem to need it for warmth, more like something to anchor him. They didn't put it on the discharge papers, Jake murmured. Didn't put anything on those, really. Just said I was done. Walked me out the gate like I'd forgotten to bring back a library book. Vince looked down at the scuffed floor tiles. Seems like a poor return for what you gave them, Jake's. Eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger. They didn't ask for much, just everything. The silence returned, but it was different now. Thicker, not uncomfortable, but heavier. Jake asked quietly, nodding toward the hallway, toward the badge wearers and fluorescents and files. No, Vince said. Not usually. Jake looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes were dark, sharp, still clear, despite the wear. Then why me? Vince didn't answer right away. He took another sip of coffee, then rested the cup on his knee. Because someone should, he said simply. Jake said nothing, but his grip on the cup eased. Just slightly. The coffee had gone lukewarm. Neither of them seemed to care. Vince stayed seated beside Maddox, elbows resting loosely on his knees, watching the faint scuff marks on the floor near the bench. It was the kind of silence that could have lasted forever. But eventually, Jake shifted his weight slightly and broke it not with a dramatic confession. Not with an explosion of emotion, but with something simpler. You ever have a moment where you know it's over before they say anything? His voice was low, rough from disuse. Like you walk off the field and the lights are already off. Vince didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Jake continued, his eyes still pointed ahead, locked on nothing. It wasn't just one. Opie, it was the last of a few that went sideways. Real sideways. Names on the list weren't the ones that came back. Stuff I can't even tell myself anymore. He ran a thumb along the seam of his coffee cup. There was no hearing, no debrief. One day I had a team, a chain of command, and the next day I had a sealed folder and a manila envelope with instructions on how to vacate government housing. Vince let the words settle. He recognized the pattern the way some vets talked when they were towing the line between remembering and reliving. Jake wasn't giving details, he was giving fragments. The pieces that hadn't gotten swallowed by classified files and trauma. No parade, Jake said. No handshake. Not even a ceremony in the mess hall. They said they were keeping it quiet for my protection. But it felt more like I was a name they wanted off the books. He paused and looked down at his hands, scarred, burned in places, calloused from work he no longer did. I didn't argue, didn't make noise, didn't file complaints. I just packed my things, what little there was, and left. Last night, on base, I slept on a cot in the gym. Nobody said goodbye. Vince nodded slowly. Where'd you go? Jake shrugged. Drove west until the gas ran out. Got a job stayed in a trailer for a while. Thought I'd rebuild a bike, or maybe write some of it down. I didn't do either. Why not? Jake hesitated, then let out a quiet breath. Because I couldn't remember what any of it was for. The missions, the medals, the secrecy. Without the structure, none of it made sense. I stopped calling. People, they stopped calling me. He took another sip of coffee. The worst part wasn't losing the team. It was the silence after. You wake up and you realize no one's tracking your vitals, no one's covering your six, and no one's coming to check if you don't show up. Vince glanced over. What about family? Jake gave a thin smile. Wife left before Columbia. Said she didn't recognize the man who came home from Bagram. Didn't blame her. I didn't recognize him either. The bench creaked slightly as Jake leaned back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling tiles. Parents are gone. No siblings. Number kids. At some point, I just stopped existing in anyone's calendar. Vince sat with that for a long while. Then, finally, he said, "So you started sleeping in the park?" "Yeah," Jake answered. "You'd be surprised how peaceful it is, out under the trees. No alarms, no questions, just wind through the branches." For the first time in years, I didn't have to be anyone. Vince looked at him not with pity, but with recognition. "But that part of you doesn't go away, does it?" Jake met his gaze. "No, it doesn't." And they sat there again, in silence. But now, it wasn't just quiet, it was shared, a place neither of them had words for. Vince sat behind the desk in the back records office, the kind they kept locked most of the time. A small desk lamp threw a narrow cone of light over the paperwork, casting long shadows across the manila folder now spread open in front of him. It wasn't much, just a few sheets, a military envelope, and a worn copy of a DD-214 discharge form. But what it lacked in volume, it made up for in silence, the kind that comes with things left out on purpose. He'd requested the file under the guise of supporting documents for verification. No one asked many questions, especially when he dropped the phrase Delta Force in a low enough tone. Most people didn't want to touch anything involving the words Joint Special Operations Command. The folder was handed over without the argument, but what was inside made him stop. Discharge, general characterization. Other than honorable, that line sat in the center of the form like a scar. Vince tapped his finger slowly against the date typed next to it, October 19th, 2013. Meant something. He reached for his own notes, a half-creased pad from earlier that day. He scanned the column he'd made for operations Maddox had been linked to, at least based on what little could be inferred from the half-redacted file retrieved. Earlier Somalia, Afghanistan, Colombia. But it was something the colonel had let slip on the phone that stuck with him. Lantern Echo. Vince typed the phrase quietly into his laptop. Not on the station's network, on his own device. A cold search, no VPN. He knew it was risky, but he needed the connection. Came up at first just light references to utility failures and tech expos with similar phrasing. But then he found it, buried deep in an old Defense Forum thread from a decade ago. Just a handful of lines. October 2013. Unconfirmed engagement in Northern Africa. Off-book JSOC insertion. Target classified. Mission referred to in rumor as Lantern. Echo, no formal press release. 3 American operators listed KIA. 1 Mia Bodis, never recovered. No medals issued. No funerals. Vince looked back at the DD-214. The discharge date matched exactly his hand, stilled on the page. He turned the form over. There was no attached statement, no further detail, no disciplinary action listed, no citations. Just a vague paragraph about failure to meet retention standards, which was often used as a placeholder, when real reasons couldn't be given. It didn't fit. This was a man who had served over 20 years, whose name showed up across 3 continents, in every major conflict, whose clearance level had likely exceeded the man signing his discharge. And yet, all it said was other than honorable. Vince leaned back in the chair, running a hand through his hair. Something had gone wrong on that last mission. Not wrong in the normal way, with bad intelligence or casualties. Something deeper. Something that couldn't be entered into a system without setting off alarms. And someone, somewhere, had made sure the paper trail made Maddox disappear. He pulled the form closer again. Looking at the final section, re-enlistment code, RE4, permanently ineligible for re-entry into any branch of the military. They'd closed the door on him, not with a trial, not with a court-martial, just with silence and a form. Vince folded the paper carefully, as if it might crack. He didn't know what Maddox had done on that mission, what decision he'd made, who he'd saved, or what order he might have refused. But he knew one thing for sure. Someone had wanted Jacob Maddox forgotten. And now he was sitting in a police station, drinking bad coffee, with his name scratched across a file that didn't tell the truth. Vince stood, slid the form back into the folder, and locked it in the drawer again. The air in the room felt heavier than before. Jake's world fit inside a rucksack, no larger than a child's school bag. Vince saw it firsthand that afternoon when the officer on duty handed the canvas bag across the counter with a hesitant glance. It looked like it had been through ones, faded olive drab canvas, frayed at the seams, and worn leather straps that had been patched with black paracord. Vince set it gently on the bench beside Maddox, who nodded once, not thanking him, just acknowledging that he understood the gesture. Maddox opened it slowly, not with possessiveness but with care, like it contained the only things left that proved he existed. No phone, no charger, no keys. Instead, there were dog-eared paper maps, some US, some overseas folded with precision. Not tourist maps, but military issue, the kind that showed elevation, water routes, and terrain gradients. Vince watched as Maddox pulled out a laminated slip from between the Pagissa fragment of what looked like an old radio call sign table. "You still use those?" Vince asked. Maddox looked up briefly, then tucked the slip back between the folds. "Of map, I don't rely on things that can be tracked." The statement wasn't paranoid, it was practiced. Vince nodded. "What about your social VA?" Jake shook his head. "Stopped going to the VA when the paperwork stopped making sense. Every time I walked in, it felt like they were reading the wrong file. They ever offer housing? They tried. Said they needed updated records, which meant new fingerprints, new scans. I didn't stay long." Vince didn't press further. He could see now how Maddox had done it. Slipped between the systems, not by accident, but by design. His whole existence had been structured around not being seen, living without, leaving marks, never thought about a phone. Vince asked quietly. Jake opened the smallest pouch of the bag and pulled out something wrapped in an old microfiber cloth. He unrolled it slowly and revealed a rusted brass compass, the kind with a cracked face and a heavy patina on the needle housing. "Still works," Jake said. "Doesn't run out of batteries. Doesn't report my location." Vince gave a soft grunt. Hard to argue with that. Jake tucked it carefully back into the lining of his boot-right ankle. Inner side, stitched pocket, a hiding place built over time. He glanced at Vince. "The phone's a leash. That's why they gave one. To every recruit. First it helps you find your squad. Then it tells command where you are. Then you leave the service, and it tells everyone else." Vince didn't disagree. He knew enough about the modern grid to recognize when someone had chosen to step off it. "Why maps?" Jake tapped one folded corner. "You learn terrain. You learn people. GPS can fail. A good map teaches you to read the land code books." Jake shrugged. "Old habit used to leave dead drops in the field. Coordinates, half sentences." It stuck with me. Vince watched him, and for a moment he saw not a homeless man, not a tired face with creased hands, but a soldier who had spent decades living one page ahead of a plan no one else could see. "You ever miss it?" Vince asked. Jake didn't answer immediately. He pulled the zipper closed again and rested both hands on top of the bag. "I don't miss the noise," he said finally. "But I miss knowing where I fit, even if it was a place no one talked about." Vince let that settle. He could feel it. Tooth weight of being useful in a world that often asked you to be invisible afterward. "You think you'll ever go back?" he asked. Jake's gaze fixed on the far wall. "To what?" And Vince realized this wasn't a man lost. This was a man removed on purpose with precision and for reasons only half known. The morning fog was still lifting off the grass as the city crew rolled in, their green vests catching the early light, their boots damped from the dew. Plastic bags rustled in gloved hands. Rakes scraped gently against the dirt paths. A leaf blower buzzed somewhere near the north entrance, kicking up a scatter of mulch and soda cans left behind by the usual night crowd. The city had assigned extra hands that week budget cleanup after an event, but most of the workers knew the rhythm of the park by now. They didn't expect much to change. A man named Ray was working the south perimeter, near the older benches under the big elm tree. He was in his 40s, built like someone who still lifted on the weekends, with a streak of silver in his beard and an old wrist brace he refused to replace. As he moved to clear the cluster of trash near the far bench, something in the air made him pause. It wasn't the smell, it was the feeling. He looked up and saw him sitting quietly with his back to the morning sun, sipping from a styrofoam cup. The canvas rucksack was back at his feet, zipped now with a fresh tear along one side from the day before. He didn't move when Ray approached, didn't speak, just gave the faintest tilt of the head. Ray stopped mid-step, blinking twice. He said, voice cautious, "You been here all night?" Jake shrugged. "Some of it." Ray looked closer, squinting against the glare. There was something familiar in the man's posture. Something not about the face, but the way he held still. Alert, but calm. Like someone waiting for a breach that might never come. "You Army, Ray?" asked Jake. Didn't answer at first. Then slowly, he gave a small nod. Ray dropped the trash bag at his feet and stepped a little closer. "You ever do any hostage recovery? Exercises down in Georgia, back in, 2007, Fort Stewart." Jake blinked slowly. "Maybe." Ray laughed once, but it wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laugh that came from remembering something so specific you couldn't believe it was real. "You were the guy with the fake mustache and the blindfold. We had to extract you from a school bus." Jake gave a quiet exhale, most a chuckle. "Yeah," Ray said. "That was you. You bit SGT Kramer when he tried to pull you out too early, told him he broke protocol." Jake nodded. "I remember. That? He broke protocol." Ray grinned wide. "Damn, I haven't thought about that in years. That was my first real training op. You were acting the part of a captured interpreter, and they told us not to go in guns blazing. We were supposed to negotiate. You stalled us for 20 minutes. Pretending you didn't speak English." Jake's lips tugged into a faint smile. They needed practice. Ray stood there for a moment, letting the surprise sink in. "What the hell are you doing here, man?" Jake didn't answer. Ray glanced at the rucksack, the styrofoam cup, the worn boots. The silence filled in the blanks. "Guess things got weird after you left." Jake looked down. Didn't exactly leave, just stepped out. Ray knelt to gather a handful of discarded wrappers. "I stuck around after I got out. Thought I'd stay in shape, do honest work, pick up trash, mow fields. Gets me out of the house." Jake nodded slowly. Ray stood again, glancing around. "You need anything? I don't got much, but I know people." Jake shook his head. "I'm okay." Ray hesitated, then reached into his vest and pulled out a small card. "Look, I run a gym on Saturdays for vets. Just loompak stuff, no fees. Sometimes guys just come by to sit and talk. You'd fit right in." Jake took the card, but didn't promise anything. Ray gave a light pat to the bench. "Good seeing you again, man. You were one tough son of a gun back then." Jake looked up at him, something behind his eyes softening just a little. "Still am, just quieter now." Ray gave a nod, picked up his rake, and walked off toward the edge of the path. The leaf blower buzzed back to life nearby. But for a brief second, in the middle of the routine hum of city work, something unseen had shifted. One man remembered. Another hadn't been forgotten after all. It was just past noon when Jake noticed the figure approaching. The bench where he sat was shaded again, tucked beneath the same elm where the confrontation had taken place. A couple of squirrels rummaged nearby, uninterested in anything but crumbs. The air carried the faint smell of exhaust from the street and fresh-cut grass from the city. Crew still finishing up a few yards away, the boy stood awkwardly on the path at first. No camera, no loud laughter, just a slouching teenager in a wrinkled hoodie and shoes to clean for someone who claimed to live rough. He held something in his hand fingers, curled tightly around it, like he hadn't fully decided if he would. "Let it go, Jake," didn't say a word. Just glanced up and went back to adjusting the torn seam on his rucksack. The boy stepped closer. His eyes never quite met Jake's. "Hey," he mumbled. Jake didn't respond. The boy hesitated, then extended. His hand? In it was the torn strap from Jake's bag. The edge was frayed badly, the canvas splitting in two directions. It had been part of the top flap. Nothing vital, but something that had belonged. "I didn't know." The boy muttered. Jake looked at the strap, then slowly reached out and took it. Not with anger, not with gratitude, just quiet acceptance. He held it for a moment, running his thumb along the tear, then tucked it back into the front pouch of the bag. The boy shifted his weight. I mean, I thought you were just, Jake. Let the silence hang. The boy tried again. Homeless. Some guy sleeping in a park. We didn't think you were like real military or anything. Just thought it was some story, like cosplay or stolen valor or something. Jake finally looked at him. Really looked. Not at his sneakers or the scuffed edges of his hoodie, but at his face. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, freckles, just barely fading from childhood. A bruise of guilt sitting under his left eye, not from a hit, but from the realization that he'd become something he hadn't meant to be. Name, Jake? Asked. The boy looked startled, then said, Lucas. Jake nodded once. You come alone? Lucas nodded back. Jake didn't move, didn't smile, didn't scowl. Why? Lucas looked at the ground. Because I saw you yesterday, after they took you. And that guy Vince, I think he picked up that card, and I saw your name. I looked it up. Jake raised an eyebrow, just slightly. I didn't get much, Lucas added quickly. Most of it was locked down. But I found enough, like those articles about the raid in Colombia, the one where they found that camp in the jungle. Some blog said a guy named Maddox went in first, took out the lookout post with just a knife. They never confirmed your name, but it lined up, same date, same ops group. Jake said nothing, just waited. Lucas swallowed. My uncle served, not in Delta, nothing like that, just a regular unit. But he said guys like you don't end up in parks unless the system breaks, and maybe the system broke. The words landed awkwardly, but not unkindly. Jake's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders loosened. I told the others what I found, Lucas said. They laughed it off, said it was probably fake, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I came back. Jake tilted his head slightly. Looking for forgiveness? Lucas shook his head. No, just to return that. And maybe just say, I'm sorry. Jake gave a long, quiet breath through his nose. Then he spoke almost too low to hear. Most people never come back. Lucas glanced up. Jake continued. Most people just throw the punch and walk away. Never check to see if the other guy's bleeding. Lucas looked down again. Jake leaned forward, reaching into the front of his rucksack. He pulled out a small, square, patch-faded gray with frayed edges and black stitching. A subdued American flag, the kind sewn to combat uniforms. Your uncle ever tell you what this means? He asked. Lucas nodded, always forward. Jake handed him the patch. Then don't waste it. Lucas took it, hands trembling slightly. Jake leaned back again, the conversation closed. The sun was shifting overhead. The squirrels were gone. Lucas turned and began to walk away, slower than he'd come. He didn't look back, but he didn't have to. Jake already had. The storage unit was on the edge of town, the kind of place tucked behind a row of discount mattress stores and a half-empty strip mall. Rows of beige roll-up doors lined the cracked pavement, and the keypad on the main gate buzzed with static. As Vince entered the code Maddox had scribbled on a napkin, the gate clattered open slowly, as if even it had grown tired of being noticed. Unit 143. Maddox walked a step ahead, keys jangling softly in his hand, his gait slightly uneven. He hadn't spoken much on the ride over. He never did, unless the silence gave him permission. Vince followed without asking questions. The place smelled faintly of oil and old dust. When Maddox stopped and slid the lock off the latch, he paused before lifting the door. His fingers hovered over the handle like he wasn't sure whether to pull or walk away. Then, in one motion, he rolled it up. The inside was dim, the light from the parking lot only spilling in halfway. No overhead bulb, no shelving, just a few stacked footlockers, a sealed metal trunk, and a canvas duffel bag so tightly packed it held its own shape. Vince stepped in slowly, eyes adjusting. It was colder than he expected. Maddox didn't gesture, didn't narrate. He walked directly to the metal trunk, the largest of the containers, and flipped open the lid. There was no ceremony, just quiet hands and old hinges. Inside was order of a kind, each item placed deliberately, but not for display. A folder of military orders, a faded commendation from a base in Kandahar, and near the bottom, a smaller box, roughly the size of a shoebox, its corners dented, its latches stiff dot. Vince stepped closer. Maddox lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in dark foam, were medals, real ones, two Purple Hearts ones still bearing the blood-stained ribbon from a field medic's patch job, a silver star, clean and polished, a distinguished service cross, and tucked beneath a folded U.S. flag was something even rarer, a Medal of Valor, awarded in Baghdad one of the early years, presented off-record by a high-ranking official whose name never made it into the news release. Vince exhaled slowly. "That's not the kind of medal they hand out quietly." Maddox didn't answer. He just reached in and touched the edge of the Valor medal with one finger, like he wasn't sure if it was still real. "He gave it to me behind a cement wall," he said. "No cameras, no press, just a handshake and a warning not to tell the story." Vince studied the arrangement. This should be in a frame. A museum, even. Maddox shook his head. Then someone would start asking questions about names, dates, people that were never supposed to be there. He removed the silver star and looked at it for a long time before returning it gently to its place. Vince crouched beside the box. "You keep all this here." "Didn't want it in the shelter," Maddox said. "Too many eyes, too many questions. This place is quiet." The air was heavy, even with nothing but concrete and steel around them. Vince picked up the folded flag and held it briefly, thumb pressing the crease. "You ever think of going to the VA with this?" Maddox met his eyes. "And say what? That I have proof they forgot me?" Vince didn't have an answer to that. Maddox replaced the flag and closed the lid again with a soft click. "It's not about what they gave me, it's about what they took." The trunk closed. The light dimmed as he stepped back. Vince stood. Slowly, "You know, I've met guys who got medals for being in the right place, but this looks like it came with cost." Maddox turned to face him fully. "Every one of these came with a name." "I don't say any more." Vince nodded. They stepped out of the unit. Maddox pulled the door down. The metal rattled against the frame, locked back in place. Silence again. In that little box sat a lifetime no. One talked about, and in the man who carried it, a story sealed in metal and dust. The VA building sat behind a row of overgrown hedges, its paint sun-bleached and windows tinted with age. Inside, the air was too cold and the lighting too bright. The kind of place where paperwork seemed louder than conversation. A faint buzz came from an old vending machine, and every seat in the waiting area had a crease from someone else's long wait. Vince had parked close, refusing to let Maddox walk the block. They stood in line together now, two men of very different pasts but standing on the same worn carpet. Maddox had his rucksack on again, cleaner now, the torn strap stitched back into place. He hadn't spoken the entire drive. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the room like he was preparing for a briefing he didn't ask for. When their turn came, the woman behind the counter was younger than Vince expected, late 30s maybe, hair in a tight bun, a small American. Flag pin on her collar. Her nameplate read Clerk T. Salinas. She glanced up with routine politeness, the kind that came from years of managing tired eyes and half-completed forms. Next, she called Maddox, stepped forward. Vince stayed close but didn't speak. Salinas reached for the clipboard. "New intake." Maddox didn't respond right away. Then he reached into his front pocket and pulled out the laminated ID, the Delta Force tag, the black one. He laid it flat on the counter, not dramatically, just matter of fact. His fingers remained on the edge. She looked at it, blinking once. Then again, her hand froze above the keyboard. Her eyes flicked up to him, scanning his face. Not just seeing him, but recognizing something in his posture. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she straightened. She picked up the ID, slowly examined it from both sides, and set it gently back down. Her voice was lower now, like something shifted in the air. "Unit Maddox," spoke quietly, "former, Tier 1. She nodded slowly. Vince watched her hands, how they moved with sudden precision now. This wasn't a clerk anymore. This was someone who had worn the uniform, someone who had learned to read a man before he said a word. She opened a drawer beneath the desk and pulled out a different form, blue, not white. "Hang tight," she said. "I need to check something." She disappeared behind a gray door. A minute passed, then another. Vince glanced at Maddox, who stood motionless, like someone who'd been trained to wait under worse conditions. When Salinas returned, her expression had changed. Still professional, but gentler. "You're not in the regular system," she said. "Not fully. There's a flag on your discharge. That's why I didn't pull up standard benefits." Maddox didn't blink. "I know." She held up a form. "But that doesn't mean it can't be corrected." He didn't respond. She added, "I served 173rd Airborne. Kandahar rotation. I've seen this before. Sometimes they push you out without asking questions, then forget to come back for the paperwork." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. She slid the form across the counter. "If you're willing to start the review process, I'll walk it through personally. No guarantee, but I know where some of the bodies are buried, if you get what I mean." Vince smiled faintly. Maddox stayed still. Salinas leaned in just slightly. "People don't carry IDs like that unless they earned them the hard way. I'll see what we can do." Maddox took the form. "Don't want pity. You're not getting it," she said. "Just help." He nodded, she added, almost as an afterthought. "And if you ever feel like coming in Tuesdays, we've got a quiet support group. Nobody talks unless they want to. You'd blend in just fine." Maddox tucked the paper into his bag. Gently Salinas pressed a small stamp onto the corner of a file and looked at Vince. "Thanks for bringing him in." Vince just said it was time. They left the building together, the air outside warmer now, the sun beginning to fall at a softer angle. No speeches, no salutes. But the door hadn't closed behind them yet. And somewhere inside, a process had quietly begun. The second visit to the VA was quieter. Maddox didn't wear the rucksack this time, just an old jacket zipped halfway and a folded paper in his pocket. Vince waited in the car while he went in alone, not out of distance, but respect. Maddox hadn't said much after the first visit, just that he wanted to see where it led. Inside, the fluorescent light still hummed. The same reception chairs lined the wall. Same waiting room television playing an old military appreciation reel with tinny sound. But something had shifted since last time. Maddox noticed it in the way people glanced at him, some nodding faintly as he passed. The clerk from before Salinas wasn't at the desk. A younger intake nurse sat in her place, hair tucked under a cap, a name tag that read L. Dorsey, and a polite smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. She took his form and typed slowly into the terminal. Her fingers paused, tapped, then backspaced, frowned, clicked again. The glow of the screen made her squint. "You're Jacob Maddox?" she asked. "Yes." She checked again, visibly unsure. Date of birth, he gave it. She typed again, then leaned back slightly. "That's strange." Maddox waited. "There's a file here," she continued, "but it's fragmented. No discharge notes, no benefits index, just some incident, codes, and a closed status flag." He didn't respond. She turned the monitor slightly, just enough for him to glimpse the screen. Most of it was a blur of acronyms and timestamps, but one section, highlighted in faded yellow, stood out clearly. "Do not flag by order." The nurse read it again, brows tightening. "I've worked here 7 years. I've never seen that language before." He said nothing, just shifted slightly in his seat. She scrolled down. "There's no caseworker assigned, no contact logs, not even a referral trail. It's like you were halfway processed, then frozen." Maddox didn't flinch. They buried it. She looked up. "Who?" He didn't answer. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Sometimes files get mishandled. A wrong digit, a lost folder. But this looks like someone meant to lose you." Maddox nodded. She opened a drawer and pulled out a standard blue intake folder. "I'm going to escalate this to our regional office. They may not be able to fix everything right away, but I want it documented." As she scribbled in the margins, she added, "You'll need a case officer, but I'm flagging this for a supervisor review first." Maddox studied her face. She was young, yes, but not naive. There was something behind her eyes, honed by repetition. "Do people like me come in often?" he asked. "Not often," she said, "but when they do, they're usually tired. Of waiting, of being forgotten." He gave a faint smile, barely there. She closed the folder and looked up. "You carried a load for someone else. Looks like when it was time to carry you, no one showed up." He nodded once. "I can't promise results," she said, "but I can promise movement." He stood slowly. "That's more than I've had in years." She handed him a stamped receipt for his intake. "We'll call you when we've got an update." "I don't have a phone," she hesitated. "Email?" "No, mail." He gave her the name of the shelter where he sometimes stopped in, and the P.O. box he checked once a month. She jotted both down. "Jacob," she said before he walked away. If you ever want to speak to someone higher up, ask for Dr. Halvorsen. He's not on the public board, but he sees cases like yours. Quietly? Maddox paused, then nodded. Noted, he left the VA through the same door. The same hedges stood outside, though they seemed shorter somehow. Vince was still in the car, reading something in the rearview mirror. Maddox climbed in, folded the intake sheet, and didn't speak. They drove away slowly, just as the clouds began to gather above. Not a storm yet, but something was shifting. The office was tucked behind an unmarked door on the third floor of a worn medical annex building. No military insignia, no plaques, just a frosted glass panel with peeling numbers and a faint scent of antiseptic in the hallway. Maddox stood outside the door for a full minute before he knocked once, softly, and stepped inside. The waiting room had 2 chairs, a water cooler, and no receptionist. No clipboard, no intake forms, just silence and the distant hum of traffic outside the window. A faint ticking came from the radiator. Maddox sat near the wall, his eyes automatically scanning the exits, noting the slight tilt of the vent in the ceiling, the kind that once meant surveillance. He hadn't waited long before the door opened. Dr. Lena Grant was in her late 40s, small in stature, dressed plainly in charcoal pants and a dark sweater. Her shoes were quiet on the tile. She didn't offer a handshake. Jess looked at him for a moment, not with pity, not even with curiosity, just recognition. She gestured to the hallway, room 3. He followed her, past 2 closed doors. The room she opened was spare. No desk, no computer. Just a simple chair in the corner, a couch near the wall, and a small table with a box of tissues and a folded note on top. Maddox looked for the clock. There wasn't one. Dr. Grant spoke calmly. "You don't have to talk today. You don't. They'd even have to stay the whole hour." He nodded once. She pointed to the note on the table. "That's for you." He picked it up, opened it slowly. A single line written in careful, blocky handwriting. "You don't have to talk. Just stay." She didn't wait for a reaction. Just moved to the far corner and sat on the floor with her legs crossed, her back to the wall. No clipboard, no pen. She didn't study him or watch his body language. She looked forward, eyes on a blank spot on the wall. Breathing slow and even, Maddox sat in the chair, the silence stretched. At first, it itched. Years of training made him count the seconds, measure the distance between noises. But here, nothing competed. No hallway chatter, no clicking keys, no hum of overhead fluorescence. Just the radiator ticking now and then, and her breathing quiet, measured, steady. 20 minutes passed, maybe 30. He didn't move, neither did she. Then something shifted. Not an emotion, not a memory, just a sensation he hadn't felt. In years, the permission to simply be still. Dr. Grant eventually stood without speaking and walked to the door. She turned the handle, opened it an inch, and said without turning around, "Same time next week, if you want." She stepped out, leaving the door ajar. Maddox looked around the room again, noted the seams in the wall paneling, the stain near the corner of the ceiling. He stared at the tissue box, untouched. Then down at the note, which he folded carefully and slid into the front pocket of his jacket. He left the room slowly, not looking back. In the hallway, she was waiting by the exit, not blocking it, just waiting. He passed her without words. Outside, the air had shifted. Cooler now. A breeze moved through the rustling trees near the parking lot. Vince leaned against the truck, arms folded, watching. He didn't ask how it went, just unlocked the door. Maddox climbed in, holding the folded paper like a fragile thing. As they pulled away, he glanced once in the side mirror, catching a final glimpse of the door marked 302. It had no badge, no rank, and no clearance level, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he'd been seen. The night came on fast, and with it, the sounds that didn't belong to the city echoes, too old to be part of the skyline. Maddox lay on his cot in the back room of the shelter, eyes open, staring at the ceiling's flickering light. He didn't sleep like the others. His body rested, but his mind stayed tethered to something just beneath the surface. Something buried, but never quite still. He heard the wind whistle against the cracked window pane, but in his mind, it wasn't wind. It was rotor wash, the kind that blasted through your bones right before boots hit the ground. He blinked once, slowly, but the hum stayed with him. Bravo 6, He hadn't said the name aloud in years, hadn't heard it spoken since the day he disappeared from the official narrative. They were ghosts now. Every one of them, except him. The memory came in shards, not like a film reel, but like a flashbulb firing at random. Northern Syria. Outside the town of Al-Hol, coordinates given by satellite. The objective was vague. Recovery and suppression. No name, no location, just a perimeter and a command frequency. Maddox had reviewed the terrain on an old, laminated map. He always carried paper backups. Even when the others laughed about it, he could still feel the weight of the gear, the desert dust sticking to his skin, the faint beep of encrypted radios. There had been 6 of them, Bravo 6, operatives who didn't show up in deployment logs. They had trained together in a part of Fort Bragg that didn't officially exist. The approach was clean, silent. They moved under cover of darkness, scanning with NVGs, trusting only the hand signals passed between them. Maddox remembered the signal to halt, then the shift in the wind. Something felt off. He remembered whispering into his comms hold position, but the order came through overridden, encrypted, and urgent. Proceed with breach. He hesitated. The override code matched. The voice wasn't familiar, but the clearance was too high to question. The breach team went in, and then light, not from explosions, but from a flare-on color. Then came the sound, not small arms, not even IEDs, something else, something buried. Maddox had moved fast, the kind of speed that only comes from years of instinct and fear stitched together. He never made it into the main structure. He was thrown backward by a pressure wave. Dust, blood, then silence. He came to alone. Covered in debris, radio silent, 2 fingers broken, his side torn open from shrapnel. Everyone else was gone. No comms, no tags, no recovery team. Just a drone circling overhead, then disappearing like it was never there. He had carried one of the others, a younger guy named Jansen Hoff, a mile toward the fallback point. Jansen died 10 minutes later. Maddox buried him under an olive tree. He was off-grid for 40 hours. Navigation by stars, water from an irrigation line. When he finally made it to the extraction point, the chopper wasn't there. But a black SUV was unmarked. American plates. A man in a suit told him the mission had never existed, that his report wouldn't be needed, that his DD-214 would be expedited. No medals, no ceremony, no casualty list, just a plane ticket, a sealed envelope, and a warning. Your country thanks you. Now disappear. Back in the shelter, Maddox turned onto his side. His ribs still ached in cold weather. He ran his fingers down his forearm, where Jansen's dog tag used to hang before he gave it to the kid's sister 2 years later. He could still smell the dirt from Syria, still hear the coded phrases, still feel the wrongness of that override. Command, they had called it, Bravo 6. He was the only one left, and no one ever said the name again. Vince didn't want to push Maddox too far, too fast. But something about the redacted files, the quiet flags in the VA system. He'd been around long enough to know what cover-ups looked like, what erasures felt like. Some files went missing because of incompetence. Others vanished because someone wanted them gone. Maddox's story reeked of the latter. Vince made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Alina Dobbins, founder of Shield Lighten Advocacy Group, focused on unsanctioned discharge cases and shadow op veterans. She had once been a field medic in Mosul, later turning her trauma into fuel for legal reform. They met back when Vince was still in uniform, working alongside congressional liaisons on policy drafts. It wasn't a warm friendship, but it was, she repeated, her voice sharpened. Ghosthound, you've heard of him. 2 cases came across my desk in 2012 and 2014, both referencing the same call sign. Both ended up sealed. One whistleblower tried to push it. He disappeared into a non-disclosure settlement and never resurfaced in any veteran appeals. What happened? Vince gave her the outline. The park, the ID, the VA record. The note that simply read, "Do not flag." Lina exhaled sharply. "Let me make a call." A day later, she called back. She had looped in Senator Clay Rourke, former Army Ranger, who had built his political career on defense reform and transparency. Rourke wasn't one for grandstanding. He had spent years in Kandahar and Ramadi before his name was ever printed. On a ballot, Alina had shown him what little she could about Maddox, just enough to light a fire. Have him sign a consent form? Alina instructed Vince. The senator wants to request his file, not the civilian VA version. The full DoD record? Maddox hesitated when Vince told him. I don't need politics. It's not about politics, Vince said. It's about having someone with clearance asking the questions that we can't. Maddox stared at the form for a long time before signing it with a slow, careful hand. Vince faxed it in. 3 days later, a secure line at the senator's office went dead. Mid-query Rourke staffer called Alina. We got partial records through Joint Special Operations Command, but every page after 2009 ends in blackout. They routed us into an unlisted branch index. It doesn't even have a department, named just numeric designators and a handler code. It's like the file was never finished, just paused, frozen. What does that mean? Alina asked. It means someone classified this manually, not by protocol, not even internally. That was rare. Even top secret files could be requested through back channels. But this one, it triggered firewalls, not red tape, internal security prompts, digital resistance. Senator Rourke tried again, this time using an authorizing privilege connected to his Armed Services Committee clearance, a level usually reserved for active intelligence assets or terminated black site operatives. What the hell was Maddox part of? Rourke muttered aloud. Alina forwarded the redacted file. Copy 2, Vince. Most of it was lines of black, but in one corner, a note had slipped through. Operator Maddox. Extraction classified. Status, technically alive. Unofficially terminated. Further review, restricted. Vince read it 3 times. Technically alive, unofficially terminated. No benefit eligibility. No contact protocol. No recognition. He looked at Maddox later that evening as they sat quietly outside the shelter, still silent, still here. Whatever had happened out there, someone had tried to write him out completely, but now someone at the top had noticed, and whoever buried the truth was about to feel the shift. Vince wasn't ready to let it go. He kept digging, not with the energy of a crusader, but with the quiet stubbornness of someone who refused to accept silence as an answer. After the firewall incident with the senator's office, the air around Maddox's case had grown colder. Doors that had once cracked open now stayed firmly shut. But Vince had one more number to try, someone he hadn't called in over a decade. General Ira Colton had retired 3 years ago. Just before whispers of his involvement in special activities, division operations became a little too loud for Washington's comfort. He had served during the same window. Maddox's unit reportedly operated in. Vince knew from a passing comment years ago that they had crossed paths if only briefly somewhere east of the Syrian border. It took a few tries to reach him. When Vince finally got the old general on the line, there was a long silence after he introduced himself. No pleasantries, just the soft crackle of a landline phone. And then the gravel-thick voice Vince remembered. You don't call unless it matters, Colton said. I need to ask about someone you may remember, Vince said. Jacob Maddox? Another silence. This one, longer. Ghosthound. The word fell like a stone. Vince didn't answer. He didn't need to. I'm not talking on an open line, Colton finally said. Call back on this number in 20 minutes. One time code and 0. Vince followed the instructions exactly. The next call routed through a secure relay server he didn't even know Colton had access to. It sounded like the man was sitting inside a concrete bunker. What do you want to know? The general asked. Was he nominated for anything after the Bravo 6 mission? A pause, then a tired sigh. He was put forward for the Distinguished Service Cross. Vince's heart quickened. Officially, yes, Colton said. I signed the preliminary citation myself. It was for extreme valor under compromised extraction, confirmed enemy elimination exceeding mission parameters, and he stopped mid-sentence. Let me guess, Vince said. You were told to pull it. Worse, Colton said. It made it all the way to the review board. I got a notification saying it was under committee examination. Then the file vanished. Vanished, redacted beyond my clearance, Colton said. I've only seen that happen 3 times in my career. Twice was CIA wet work they were trying to erase. Third was Maddox. Did he ever know? I don't think so, Colton said. His status was changed to general. Discharged before I could inform him. When I pushed back, I got a memo reminding me that I was not authorized to question operational declassification decisions. Then they reassigned me to a paper post in Germany for 6 months. Vince sat in silence, processing. He saved lives. Out there, didn't he? Vince asked quietly. He brought someone home, Colton said. 2 hostages, 1 dead teammate, 6 confirmed enemy targets, neutralized under blackout conditions. No air support, no comms, no satellink, just a wristwatch, compass, and his own goddamn spine. Do you have anything left? Paper trail, draft citation. Colton gave a grim laugh. I printed a copy, one back when it was still viewable, kept it in a box with my own award papers. I'll scan it and send it under a burner alias. Don't attach my name to it. I won't, Vince promised. The scan arrived hours later. A crisp, high-resolution image of the original citation draft, name SGT, Major Jacob R. Maddox, action date, November 14th. Location, redacted. Nature of action, heroism under direct enemy fire with disregard for personal safety, contributing to the rescue of multiple lives and the disabling of a classified threat actor. Stamped diagonally across the top in thick black letters, withdrawn record sealed per ops-54-echo. Vince stared at the screen for a long time, then printed a copy. That evening, he handed it to Maddox in a manila envelope. Maddox didn't open it right away, just looked at Vince. You don't have to read it, Vince said, but I thought you should have it. Later, when Vince walked past Maddox's cot in the shelter, he saw the envelope open, the citation resting on top of his blanket. One finger held it in place, and Maddox's eyes were closed, but not asleep. Breathing was steady, not haunted, not calm, just still. The kind of still that meant something had returned to him, something no metal could give, but that the absence of it had quietly stolen for years. The envelope was small, plain, and creased slightly along the edges, like it had been carried in a jacket pocket for days before finally being mailed. Vince found it in the shelter's front desk inbox, tucked between a VA flyer and a church bulletin. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, but hesitant. The kind of writing someone uses when they aren't sure how their words will be received. He held it up to the light. Before handing it over to Maddox, "This one's for you." Maddox looked at it for a long time before reaching out. His fingers hovered over the return address. San Diego, a street name he didn't recognize. Then he flipped it over and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, handwritten in black ink. No greeting, no dramatic opening, just a short, quiet message. "I saw your name in a post online. I think I'm your kid. My name's Caleb. My mom's name was Hannah. She passed away last year. She told me about you before she went. I don't want anything. I just wanted you to know I exist. I just thought maybe you'd want to know you're not alone, Caleb." Maddox read it twice, then folded it back along the original crease, careful and deliberate. He didn't say anything, didn't blink fast or clear his throat. He just sat still for a long time, like the ground had shifted slightly beneath him, and he wasn't sure if it was solid again yet. Vince didn't speak. He just moved to the other chair and waited. "I knew about the pregnancy," Maddox said. "I left before he was born. I wasn't allowed to say where I was going. Told Hannah it was a long deployment," she cried, but she said she understood. His voice was flat, but something under it was shaken. "I tried writing once," Maddox continued. "From Turkey, used an old church address. Supposed to contact anyone, thought maybe it was safer that way. Maybe it didn't matter." Vince didn't correct him, didn't say that. Of course it mattered. "I don't even know what to say back," Maddox muttered, almost to himself. "What do you say after 2 decades? You say thank you for writing," Vince said. "You say you're here." Maddox ran a hand through his short hair. "He doesn't want anything. That's not why he wrote. Not heavy, just thick with the sound of something returning. A name, a link, a voice." That night, Maddox stayed up, writing a letter. No typewriter, no laptop. Just the same lined paper and a cheap ballpoint pen from the shelter's front desk. He filled a full page, then another. Just fragments, memories, names. A quiet explanation of why he disappeared and how he never stopped wondering. He included a note at the end. "If you don't want to talk again, I understand. But if you ever do, I'd like to know what your life has been like. Even the boring parts. Especially those, your dad, I hope it's okay I call myself that. He sealed the envelope himself and walked it to the corner mailbox before dawn. When he came back, he didn't say anything. Not yet, but something close to permission. The beginning of being seen. It started with a single pair of boots. Vince didn't say who left them. Maybe he didn't even know. They appeared overnight scuffed brown combat boots, soles worn thin, laces still knotted. Placed neatly beneath the park bench where Maddox, not performative, just placed. The next morning, Maddox stood staring at them for nearly 10 minutes. Vince didn't ask what he was thinking. He just watched from the walking path, letting the silence speak. The boots stayed there all day. That evening, someone added, a folded field cap, green-gray, and faded around the rim. By the third morning, there was a small, laminated note taped under the bench for Ghosthound. A few friends of Vince, some still in uniform, others long retired. Quiet conversations at the VFW, a whispered story passed between a City Hall employee and a local news volunteer. No headlines, no grand campaign. Just people who had once served or known someone who had. People who understood what it meant to vanish. Then came the Patchetts, Marine Recon, 10th Mountain, 160th SOAR. Even a rare SEAL Team 6 insignia that someone had pressed into the wood like it belonged there. Next came the coined small challenge coins with unit crests and Latin mottos, some wrapped in folded tissue or pinned under stones to keep them from blowing away. There was no structure to it, no announcement. It was just happening. One afternoon, Maddox walked the perimeter of the park. Not because he didn't know where to go, but because he was overwhelmed. The bench was no longer empty. A woman with a toddler had sat down near it, unaware of what the objects meant. But she smiled at Maddox when she saw him pass. "You the one they left this for?" she said, and then turned her attention back to her child, who was trying to feed a pigeon a crumpled cracker. Later that evening, Vince saw someone kneeling at the bench with a wood-burning tool, a teenage boy, not Lucas, but another kid from the same group that had mocked Maddox the first time. He didn't look up when Vince approached, just kept tracing the letters slowly, carefully, into the backrest of the bench, "Welcome home." It wasn't elaborate, just those two words when he finished. The boy packed up his kit and left without a word. Maddox sat there for a while after. He didn't touch anything, didn't pick up the coins or move the boots. He just sat, elbows on his knees, staring out. Over the field where kids now played soccer and a woman pushed a stroller past a row of dogwood trees, the park had changed, but not in any way that tourists would notice. It wasn't cleaner or louder or more colorful. It was simply acknowledged, a space where someone once unseen had become part of the landscape, not as a curiosity, not as a tragedy, but as a man. Eventually, someone planted a small American flag in the soil beneath the bench. Then another flag appeared the next day, and another. By the end of the week, there were 5. Vince watched it all unfold without orchestrating a thing. No press releases, no speeches, just quiet presence, quiet memory. He walked past Maddox one morning and said, "Looks like you've got a squad again." Maddox didn't respond immediately. Then he glanced at the boots, the coins, the flag. "Maybe I never really lost them," he said, and in the cool shade of the old trees, under the slow bloom of something like healing, the bench stayed full. Of things, of meaning, of welcome. It was just after 7 in the morning when Vince heard the knock. Not the casual kind firm, even deliberate. 3 short raps, spaced out, no hesitation. He opened the door, still in his t-shirt, and saw the black government SUV idling at the curb, lights off, engine running low. A woman stood on the porch, mid-50s, short-cropped hair, no makeup, no jewelry, just pressed slacks, a windbreaker, and a presence that spoke of years in command. She extended a hand without introduction. Her grip was strong, and when she spoke, there was no mistaking her tone. Brigadier General Alina Ruiz, retired. "I'm here about Jacob Maddox." Vince hesitated a beat, then opened the door wider. "Come in." She stepped inside like she had once stepped into briefing tents, war rooms, and field hospitals quietly, with total awareness of her surroundings. Her eyes scanned the living room, not out of judgment, but habit. "I saw the story. Someone mentioned the name Ghosthound." "I didn't believe it at first," she said, sitting carefully in the chair. Vince motioned to but the details matched. A park, a bench, a man with nothing. I had to see for myself. Vince studied her face. She looked tired beneath the surface. Not the kind of tired from sleep deprivation, but the kind from carrying too many years of silence. "You said you knew him," he asked. She nodded. "He saved my life in '05 Columbia, Operation Harrogate. Most people don't even know it happened. Vince didn't. He waited. We were embedded with a joint task force," she said, interdiction and extraction. "It went sideways. Communications cut. We were ambushed to clicks outside the extraction zone. I was the intel officer, not front line. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was tagging a safe house personally." Looked down at her hands, briefly losing focus. "He pulled me out of a collapsed structure under fire. I had a shattered tibia. He carried me 2 miles through jungle, no GPS, bleeding from a wound in his own leg. He never gave his name. Just handed me to the evac crew and vanished into the trees." She glanced up, I found out later. Through a secure channel, his codename was Ghosthound. Vince nodded slowly. "He's here, still quiet, still doesn't say much. Can I see him?" she asked. Vince didn't answer right away. Maddox didn't like surprises, but something told him this wasn't the kind of visit that could wait. "Usually at the park by 8, Vince said. "Same bench." Ruiz stood. "Then I'll go the same way I met him," without ceremony. When she arrived, the sun was just beginning to climb over the trees. Maddox was seated in his usual spot, coffee in hand, eyes on the field. The boots and challenge coins still lined the ground beneath the bench. A folded field flag sat neatly. Behind him, untouched. He didn't look up right away when she approached, but then something about the cadence of her footsteps made him turn. She didn't speak, neither did he. After a long pause, she said simply, "You carried me through the dark." He squinted slightly, recognition dawning slowly, painfully. He said, barely audible. She sat beside him. "I never got to thank you. I made it my business to know." There was silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was layered thick with everything unspoken across 20 years, with every file sealed, every mission erased, every face left behind. "I heard what they did," she said. The discharge, the silence. It should never have happened. "I stopped trying to correct them," Maddox replied. "Didn't have the energy." She reached into her pocket, pulled out a ribboned metal case, and set it gently in his lap. "This was supposed to be yours." He didn't open it, just looked at it. And then, finally her. "Why now?" "Because someone finally said your name again," she said, "and I still owe you a debt." He nodded once. For the rest of the morning, they sat together without speaking, just two soldiers who had lived long enough to see the ghosts come back, one by one, not to haunt, but to remind. ChatGPT said, the floor of the Senate chamber wasn't usually where stories like Jacob Maddox's were told. Most days, it echoed with legislation, policy debates, and rehearsed speeches that vanished into the air. Hadn't already made up their mind, but that day, it was different. Senator Ethan Maris, a former Army Ranger with a quiet reputation for doing more than talking, stood with a printed file in one hand and a set of declassified pages in the other. The room wasn't full, but it was listening. "I stand today. Not to introduce a bill," he began, "but to correct an omission. Not from our laws, but from our memory." He spoke without theatrics, just facts. A man named Jacob R. Maddox, retired Sergeant Major, former Delta Force operative, a man whose file, until last week, did not officially exist. The push had taken weeks. Maris had pulled every favor, called in retired generals, and forced meetings behind closed doors. Eventually, someone blinked. A partial file arrived in his office via diplomatic courier. It bore the emblem of the Department of Defense and, across the top, in faded black ink, the title, Operation Lantern Echo. The mission had never been acknowledged before, not in hearings, not in press releases, not even among military circles. It was one of those words whispered but never confirmed, until now. As the senator laid out the facts, members of the chamber shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward. Others pretended not to listen, but none of them interrupted. Operation Lantern Echo was conducted in late 2006. Maris read aloud. Its objective: disrupt a high-level paramilitary narcotics pipeline intersecting with insurgent training grounds along the Afghan-Pakistan border. The team involved was designated as non-attributable, which meant they didn't exist. No names, no records, no backup. He paused, but they existed, and so did their sacrifices. The file had only partial entries. The rest was redacted whole. Paragraphs blacked out, names blurred, dates smudged. But Maddox's name was there. Not as a footnote, not as a suspect, but as the operations field lead. He had coordinated exfil routes, managed multiple asset recoveries, and, according to a buried commendation memo, demonstrated singular valor during hostile entrapment, resulting in the survival of 2 additional operatives. What wasn't mentioned was the aftermath. The file made no reference to the days spent in enemy territory after the mission collapsed. It didn't speak of the 2 men Maddox carried to safety or the wounds he sustained that never made it into a hospital chart. It didn't mention the tribunal that followed or how the brass had looked away, instead of speaking up when his discharge paperwork was quietly downgraded. But now it was on the record, at least in part, back at the shelter. Maddox sat in the rec room, watching the speech on a flickering flat screen donated by a local business. Vince sat beside him, silent. Around them, a few residents listened, some unsure what they were hearing. A couple of older vets nodded slowly. When Maris spoke Maddox's nameful, formal, and clear, something in the room changed. A weight shifted. Maddox didn't react visibly, but Vince noticed the subtle things, the way his shoulders straightened, the way his fingers stopped fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. "You okay?" Vince asked. Maddox nodded slowly. "It's strange." "What is?" "Hearing my name spoken like it still matters." Vince said nothing, just let the words hang in the air. Later that evening, an envelope arrived. It contained a printed transcript of the senator's remarks and a personal note, handwritten in black ink. "No man should have to wait this long to be seen. Welcome back, Sergeant Major." It wasn't absolution. It didn't fix the years that had passed in silence or the damage done by the bureaucratic void, but it was something. It was a beginning. The letter came in a plain manila envelope. No seal, no ceremony. Just a return address from the Department of the Army, tucked neatly in the corner. Vince found it in the mailbox and turned it over twice before knocking gently on the door to Maddox's small room. The older man was sitting in the armchair by the window, tying one of his boots, though he hadn't planned to go anywhere that day. He always kept the habit. Vince held out the envelope, but said nothing. Maddox took it, ran a thumb across the edge, and let it sit on his lap for a moment. The last time he had received something official from the Army, it had ended everything. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what this one would mean, but he opened it anyway. The first page was brief, just a few paragraphs typed in rigid official format. A decision from the Army Review Board. Effective immediately, Jacob R. Maddox's discharge status was amended from general other than honorable to honorable. Along with the decision came a note about reinstated benefits, pension, medical, all retroactive. There would be no public statement, but the letter included something else. A paragraph written outside the form, italicized. This board acknowledges that SGT, Major Maddox's record, reflects extensive service under extraordinary and classified circumstances. The previous discharge decision is hereby recognized as an administrative error, not reflective of the soldier's conduct or contributions. No one signed it by name, just a printed title, Office of Military Corrections and Review. Maddox read it once, then again. He set the paper down on the small side table, reached for the envelope, and pulled out the second page. It was an apology, not the kind read at press conferences or shared in media briefings. Just a single paragraph addressed to him directly. No official letterhead, no salutation, just words typed in a cleaner font with none of the formalities. "We cannot undo what was lost, but we can acknowledge it should never have been taken. Your service was never forgotten by those who knew. We regret the delay. We recognize the cost." Maddox stared at that line. We recognize the cost, as if it had weight beyond paper. He folded the note once, carefully, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he looked up at Vince, who hadn't said a word the whole time. "They didn't have to," Maddox said, "but they did," Vince replied. That afternoon, a quiet change took place. Maddox walked into the local VA office with papers in hand. The same clerk who had once stared in disbelief now stood and escorted him to the back, where new intake forms were waiting. No more flags, no more denials. His ID was scanned, verified, and accepted. The screen blinked green. A small thing but monumental dot word began to travel, quietly but steadily, through veteran networks, through whispers in military halls. Ghosthound was back in the system. Not as a problem, not as a ghost, but as a soldier who had served and sacrificed at the park. Someone had added a new plaque near the bench bolted into the wood, simple and unadorned. It read, SGT Madge, Jacob Maddox, U.S. Army Delta Force, RET. Operation Lantern Echo Still. Standing, Maddox saw it a few days later. He didn't touch it, just sat in his usual spot, coffee in hand, and watched the trees sway above him. The boots and coins were still there, weathered now. Lucas, the teen from before, passed by again, this time with his grandfather, who stopped and saluted the plaque. Is that really him? The old man asked quietly. Lucas nodded. Yeah, that's him. At a distance, Maddox didn't hear the words, but he saw the gesture, the quiet recognition. No camera phones, no laughter, just a moment of stillness. Later that evening, when the sun had dipped behind the buildings and the last jogger had passed, Vince found Maddox still at the bench. They gave your name back, he said. Maddox nodded. Slowly, it was never really mine to begin with. I just tried not to lose it. Vince didn't respond. He didn't have to. Sometimes a name is more than a label. Sometimes it's a lifeline, a thread that ties a man back to everything he gave, everything he lost, and everything he still carries. And that day, in a city park where silence once hid a soldier, that thread was finally reattached, quietly, completely. The morning was overcast, the kind of gray that softened everything it touched. No banners, no amplified music, no polished speeches. Just a gathering at the edge of the county veterans cemetery, where a folding table held black coffee and paper cups, and an honor guard adjusted their caps beneath the flag. It was Veterans Day, but this wasn't one of the large ceremonies broadcast on local television or shared in Facebook albums. This one was for the ones who didn't ask for applause, the ones who didn't show up in uniform or talk about where they'd been, the ones who sat at the back, kept their stories folded away, and nodded quietly to others who had done the same. Maddox arrived just after the color guard assembled. He wore his old jacket, no medals, no stripes, just the deep olive green that had faded to gray at the shoulders. Vince walked beside him, but kept a respectful distance once they reached the flagpole. Maddox stood still, his hands behind his back, eyes trained on the stars and stripes as they rose slowly up the staff. His posture hadn't changed, but a few did. One man, older, with a limp and an airborne pin on his lapel, made his way over. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask questions. He just stood beside Maddox for a moment and said, "Lantern Echo." Maddox nodded once. The man placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "I thought nobody made it out." Then he turned and walked away. Another came by, a woman in her 50s, Navy insignia stitched onto her windbreaker. "Didn't know you were real," she said softly. "They told us you were a ghost story." Maddox offered a small, wry smile. "Sometimes I wasn't sure either." The ceremony continued without interruption. A local high school quartet played a slow rendition of taps. Names were read. Flowers were laid. But there was a quiet undercurrent running beneath it, all murmurs from veterans who had heard of a man named Ghosthound, seen his name tucked into operational rumors, his call sign scribbled into after-action reports without context. They'd never seen his face, until now. When the final bell rang, a single solemn chime struck by a Marine with one arm, the crowd bowed their heads. Maddox didn't move. He kept his gaze steady, breathing slow and measured. Vince noticed at first a ripple. The honor guard, all retired, all volunteers, turned together in Maddox's direction. One by one, each of them raised their hand in salute. No announcement, no cue. It was instinct, recognition without words, and Maddox slowly, deliberately, returned it. His hand rose in one smooth motion, stopping sharp at the brim of his capless forehead. The form was perfect. Not rusted by time, not softened by years outside the line, just pure, clean precision. Then one more ripple. From the audience, others began to rise. A man in a wheelchair lifted a trembling arm. A woman with service ribbons pinned to her chest wiped her eyes and stood at attention. One by one, those who had worn a uniform followed. Not everyone, just those who understood. Not for what Maddox had done, but for what he'd carried. 4 years spent erased, for sacrifices folded into silence, for showing up even when no one had asked him to. The salute lasted no more than 8 seconds, but it stretched wider than the lawn they stood on. It reached past missions left unspoken and comrades buried, without names. It filled the space where recognition had once been denied, and then, quietly, it ended. Maddox lowered his hand. Let the silence settle again. Vince came to stand beside him, offering no words. The woman from earlier returned, handing him a single dog tag on a chain. Don't know if it's yours, she said, but it came from someone who swore he owed his life to a ghost in the mountains. Maddox looked at it. The name was worn down, the letters barely visible, but he held it tight. The ceremony dissolved slowly. People trickled away. No reporters, no medals, just footsteps on soft earth. Maddox remained a while longer, seated now, watching the emptying chairs and folded flags, not waiting for anything, just letting the weight lift bit by bit. Some salutes aren't meant to be witnessed by crowds. Some are quiet, heavy, and final that day. One man received a salute, not for what he represented, but for who he was, when the world wasn't looking. The room was small but clean. A cot in the corner, a dresser with 3 drawers that still creaked when opened, and a single window that faced a narrow alley just wide enough to catch the morning sun. The walls were bare, no pictures, no plaques, just a clock that ticked a little too loudly, and a calendar that Vince had pinned to the door in case Maddox ever wanted to mark the days. But Maddox never did. He woke early, always before the alarm, sometimes in the dark, sitting upright with breath-held eyes, already searching the shadows for movement. His hands would tighten briefly, then release, as he reminded himself quietly, deliberately, that this was a room, not a barracks, that he was no longer in a perimeter, no longer waiting for radio silence to break. He rarely spoke of the dreams. When he did, it was only in fragments, names without faces, buildings without doors, orders that came in whispers, sometimes from voices he couldn't place. But when morning came, he dressed the same way each deboots first, laced tight, then the faded jacket, then the small leather pouch he still kept tucked behind his belt loop. Inside it, a compass, a piece of old code paper, and a dog tag. With no chain, Vince had made sure the room came with a key, a small thing, but one that mattered. Maddox had once said that in all his years overseas, he'd never carried a key-only access cards and codes. The idea of turning a lock, choosing when to open or close a door, was still foreign. Still strange, he rarely used the key. Most days, he walked the path from the apartment to the park was 15 minutes on foot, less if he took the side street. The park hadn't changed much, though the bench had. Someone, likely the city or perhaps a quiet donation, had replaced the wood planks with new ones. The bronze plaque was still there. So were the boots, now faded from rain and time, and a pair of miniature flags that someone kept replacing, though no one claimed to, sat in the same spot every morning as the sun cut through the tree line and filtered down in thin beams. His posture remained unchanged, shoulders straight, feet flat, hands resting just above his knees. He didn't read, didn't sleep, just watched. Vince came by around the same time each day. He always brought coffee in a plain white cup with no logo. Sometimes he'd talk about small things, like grocery prices or the odd neighbor across the hall who vacuumed at 3 a.m. Sometimes he said nothing at all. He just sat nearby, drinking his own coffee, letting the silence settle where it needed to. There were no more teens with phones, no more laughter meant to sting. The space around Maddox was quiet now, but not in the way it used to be. Not empty, not hollow. The quiet had weight. Respect people had started walking slower when they passed him. Some nodded. A few paused long enough to read the plaque. One jogger, early 30s, maybe stopped once, saluted silently, then kept going. No words, just the motion. Maddox never responded outwardly, but Vince noticed a small shift in his shoulders. A breath held just a second longer. Recognition. He still didn't talk about the missions. Not in full, But once, as the two sat watching the sun rise through the misted trees, Maddox spoke. "It was never about getting back," he said quietly. "It was about not disappearing." Vince didn't answer. He didn't need to. The park had become something else now. Not a battlefield, not a refuge. Just a place where a man could sit without vanishing. Where presence alone meant something. The cat remained in the room, the calendar still untouched. But every morning, before the light reached the park, Maddox woke lightly, as if listening for movement that never came. He would lace his boots, tie his jacket, and step out into the world, with no orders to follow, just the habit of not being gone. He walked, not because he had somewhere to be, but because for the first time in years, he could choose where to go.